watching Political Exchange, and of course my guest tonight is Nick Kaufman. He's the international criminal lawyer in South Africa, looking at the case against a client who is on Interpol's most wanted list. But of course, he is also the lawyer to some of the most notorious political leaders in the world. You have represented members of the Gaddafi family who have insisted that the International Criminal Court of Justice look into the killing of the former Libyan leader. Take us through your association with the Gaddafi family. Of course, a lot of interest, particularly in Africa, on that, and the fate of the various Gaddafi children as it relates to either outstanding warrants or extraditions between countries.
Yes, well, I was first approached by Saadi Gaddafi, who is the one of the former leader's sons, the football player who had left Libya at the time of the crisis and found refuge in Niger. He petitioned various requests to the United Nations Security Council, for example, for a lifting of the travel ban which had been imposed upon him. And I assisted him in those particular matters. In the course of representing Saadi, I received communication from his sister, Aisha, who at that stage was, severely traumatized, because it was very soon after the murder of her father, severely traumatized by this incident, which was broadcast throughout the world on various video clips, brutal murder. She wanted me to petition various institutions to see what could be done to investigate the murder and to bring the people who perpetrated it to justice. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, the International Criminal Court is seized of the Libyan situation as a result of the United Nations mandate, which had been granted to it by the Security Council. And the mandate stipulated that the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has to investigate all aspects of the conflict.
Not including the murder of former Libyan leader
Well,
Muammar
it didn't
Gaddafi.
specifically state you have to investigate the murder of Muammar Gaddafi. Of course not. The mandate from the Security Council was to investigate crimes which had been committed in the course of the revolution and thereafter. So one of the most notorious crimes, of course, is the crime which was committed against the former head of state. Now, when the prosecutor is examining a situation, can't just choose to examine one party or one side of this of the conflict. He has to examine all aspects of the conflict, including the actions of the rebels. Now, the present prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, has announced in her last report to the United Nations Security Council that she does intend to look at the actions of the rebels. But one of the most notorious actions of the rebels is, of course, the murder of Muammar Gaddafi. And now this is a case which has been documented. There have been videotapes. The evidence is there. It could have been gained immediately if the Office of the Prosecutor, which did have the mandate at the time, went to the scene of the crime, had taken ballistic evidence, had taken forensic evidence, if a proper autopsy had been done on the body of Muammar Gaddafi and, of course, his son, Mutassim, who was also murdered in the most brutal fashion. If all these things had been done, then a credible case could have been formulated and brought against the people responsible for.
And why do you think the
murder.
ICC didn't do that?
Well, it's hard to guess why. I mean, I can only infer that perhaps the people who are pushing in various directions, pushing the people at the ICC, are putting the emphasis on other aspects of the conflict, and perhaps nobody really wants to know the real reason why Muammar Gaddafi was murdered and who did it. Perhaps there is more to hide than that. People just don't want to come out into the open. I really don't know the reason why. I firmly believe, however, that this matter should be investigated. It has to be investigated. It was an awful crime. No matter what you think of the man, no matter what you think of what he did, and he did a lot of good for Africa, I must say, his murder was one of the most abhorrent acts witnessed in recent times.
Now, if you have that kind of selectivity from international bodies, to what extent do you think the individuals that eventually end up, like some of your clients in front of the ICC, stand any chance of having a fair, trial, and that the procedures would be legal and lawful? We know that Charles Taylor, former African head of state, has been found guilty, and many people will say that is a victory, particularly for in light of what happened to the people of Liberia. But are those processes, given the kind of shortcomings in the international arena, are those processes even necessary? Ought we not to find other ways, more inclusive ways, to try those charged for either genocide or crimes against humanity?
Well, you're touching on a very mooted issue in international justice. I mean, whether it's better to have trials or truth and reconciliation commissions. I mean, one of the best examples, of course, here I am sitting here in South Africa.
Yes.
In the post-apartheid era, the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. I mean, yes, there are advantages to truth and reconciliation, and there are, of course, advantages to war crimes trials.
Like the Nuremberg trials?
Like the Nuremberg trials, for example. Now, if you say, the International Criminal Tribunals, places where justice is dispensed in the most, shall we say, efficient fashion and fair fashion, well, that's a moot issue as well. I'm not going to stand here or sit here in the course of this interview and criticise the judges of the International Criminal Court. Of course not. I assume that the judges are carrying out their duties in the most professional manner, and I have no reason to suspect otherwise. However, criticisms can be made of various tribunals as can be made of any court of law in a domestic country. And you touched on the issue of Charles Taylor, for example. Well, Charles Taylor was convicted and sentenced to 50 years. His appeal is the result of his appeal is still pending. But there was one judge who dissented.
Right.
And when he tried to read out his dissent, the microphone was shut off on him.
Wow.
Now, that became a very hot issue as well amongst academics and people who are involved in international justice. I mean, what right did the court have to switch off the microphone of a judge who was merely expressing his right to express a dissenting opinion? So yes, criticism can be levelled, but by and large, the International Criminal Court has shown itself. I'd also like to add, with respect to the quality of justice dispensed at the International Criminal Court, I mean, a lot of criticism has been made that it's Afrocentric, but let's not forget that the court has rendered a number of judgments. Well, one judgment in a trial, but in which it has convicted somebody, that was Lubanga, but it's also acquitted somebody most recently, and that's in Matthew Ngujolo-Chu, involved in the Democratic Republic of Congo conflict. It has also dismissed the charges against a Sudanese warlord, and it has also dismissed the charges against a former client of mine, Calixto Mbarashimana. So to say that the International Criminal Court is biased in favour of the prosecution is totally not true. You
were a prosecutor of the court and also a defender. It's not an unusual thing, but from where you're standing at a philosophical, ethical, point of departure, when does a client become someone who doesn't deserve representation, or does everyone, no matter how heinous the crime that they're accused of, deserve the right to be represented?
Well, my answer to that is quite simple. Everybody deserves a right to representation, fair and competent representation. Everyone deserves a right to a fair trial. Whether or not I would choose to represent everyone is a separate matter entirely.
Now, of course, you have had clients who have been accused of genocide. Particularly in the Bosnian conflict, you are Jewish, you live in the state of Israel, and given the history of the Jewish people, how comfortable are you with representing people who are accused of genocide?
Well, being Jewish, you will know that our religion is governed by the law which was given on Mount Sinai to Moses. So the law is a fundamental part of my religion. As I said, I believe everybody has the right to representation.
Even obviously, Nazis?
Even Nazis, yes. But then, as I stressed earlier, would I represent a Nazi? Well, the answer is no. There would be a conflict of interest involved in that. I would feel it difficult to represent, for myself personally, to represent a Nazi.
Philosophically, where you come from, How often, when you get a client off, do you believe justice has been served, or have you served the interests of your client?
Well, I don't like to talk about clients getting off. I like to think that that justice has been done, and that if a client has been acquitted, then it's either because he did not do the crime, for which he fully deserves to be acquitted, or because the prosecution's evidence does not substantiate the charges against him beyond a reasonable doubt. And let's don't underestimate the importance of what I've just said, because yes, maybe he is guilty at the end of the day, but then it's far better that somebody who is guilty is acquitted because the prosecution's case is not built as it should have been built, than convicting him on the basis of faulty evidence. Because if you sanction that type of prosecution, then you're basically saying, well, let's convict everybody on the basis of insufficient evidence. And yes, it is better that the one guilty person does get off than you convict a whole load of people on the basis of faulty evidence.
Now, on the scale of, let's say, accusations or charges of the very colourful client list that you have, what was, in your view, the most difficult thing to defend, and what did you grapple with in terms of not just the question of the law, but your own sense of what is right or wrong?
Well, I personally think that the most difficult case to defend that I've dealt with was the case of Calixton Barishimana. He was alleged to have been the Secretary General of a Hutu emigre movement operating in the northeast Congo, the FDLR. I found this difficult because the charges which were levelled at him were outrageous. I mean, it was the most brutal and abominable mutilation of women, rapes, and the way that the crimes were linked to him were quite spurious. I mean, he was expressing his freedom of speech. He was sitting in France, never actually been to that part of Congo at the time period relevant to the charges, and essentially this was a case where the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, wanted to get a scapegoat for the crimes which had been committed, the awful and horrible crimes which had been committed in Congo at that moment in time. He was accessible. He was down the road in Paris, a few hundred kilometres away from the International Criminal Court, and there's no question that he could have been brought before the court very quickly. But was it fair and was it right to pin on him these awful crimes? And the answer is absolutely not, because his actual statements which he'd made, and the case was based on a mode of liability where they were alleging that he was a party to a conspiracy on the basis of being a spokesman for the movement, for the FDLR movement, when his messages to the public were basically calling for peace in the region. And so the way the prosecution built the case was by turning the messages on their head and saying that he was covering up for crimes which were being committed. It's quite ludicrous, and fortunately the judges of the International Criminal Court saw through that, but then the consequences of losing that case were awful. I mean, seeing a client to be convicted and demonized in the face of the in the face of the international community for crimes like that was awful.